which is a good one. It doesn't really matter who owns the company. It does matter that they have an income they can live on, and that they can afford school fees and so on. And somehow I understand, sort of course, still as an outsider, I understand the historic background to why the focus is so much on ownership, because of the injustice of the previous system and the history of colonialism. But I find it interesting how little focus there is on income, and I would like to just ask if you have a reflection on that.
Okay, we'll go with the chap who got the mic, and the other mic goes over there. Sir?
Right. Thanks a lot. Jack Kossef from day jobs working for the Premier of Gauteng, but I guess I'm asking this in my personal capacity. Neva, I just wanted to put you into one of possibly your more traditional footings, looking at value chain analysis, because one of the things that we are really sort of looking at quite actively from the Gauteng side is how to break down barriers to economic opportunity by activating the township economy more thoroughly. And so a lot of the work that we've done, for example, we've surveyed 80,000 firms in 9 townships across Gauteng that are on the formal-informal boundary and are actively linking them to the formal economy. What it's revealed is that our value chain diversification is sclerotic. The formal economy right now doesn't really understand how to diversify itself, to deconcentrate itself. And I mean, you've mentioned some warnings about some bad policy directions we could go down. It seems obvious to me there are some very good policy directions that are similarly radical about if we do deconcentrate the way value chains work and the way supply chains work in this country. Just wanted to understand your feeling of where that should be in the policy hierarchy.
Thanks, Jack.
My name is Sipho Masigo. I'm from 1912 Radio. I work with at least about 28 young people. I've got a serious concern as a young man myself, especially looking at this document presented by the professor. In the last 24 years, some of you leaders sat through documents such as GEAR, ASGISA, the New Growth Path, the NDP. My God. You still don't have a solution. Our people are hungry, our people are starving, and 4 of you stood up, you all disagreed with your ideologies. I'm really confused. What are we gonna do? I mean, my reality is I see young people hungry every day. I see young people trying to find job opportunities, young people looking for mentors. You know, my question to you would be, who are you mentoring? Who are you supporting? Who are you paying for their school fees? What are you doing? I mean, we can all sound smart here, which is nice, but, you know, this country is in a mess because some of the educated people have been talking and talking, and nothing is happening. It's just, I'm really concerned, especially when young people ask sometimes for taxi fares on a daily basis. So, what are you guys doing?
Okay, thank you very much. Who wants to go first? Gavin? You get it. Have you got your mic? Okay, as we get ready to answer, can I just say in response to the last colleague that while I think we all share the sentiment, if you want to understand that hardship, you don't have to be out of this place. The inequality in society is inside this university. If you walk out in the evening when you leave here, you'll go past the syndicate rooms of my colleagues at the business school, which litter that way. And you'll find the lights are on all night because students are sleeping there, because it's warm. And the students come to us at about 9 o'clock at night and they say, can you go to Mike's and buy us some food, please? And it's not because we're hungry. It's because we're so hungry we can't sleep. And the academics in this and almost every other school have a small pot of money that they put money into every month to buy food for those students who can't afford the taxi drive home and can't afford res, are sleeping in rooms and can't eat. And so if you ask what we're doing, we're trying to educate the next generation to do better than we've done. That may seem small and irrelevant, but it's what we do. But it's coupled with direct assistance, dipping into your funds to pay student fees. Every single person on this panel is paying student fees, not for our children, we're paying for them as well, but for students who are sitting, some of them in this room. So I think I take the point, and it's a fair question, but I think to expect 4 economists to agree with each other and come up with a solution is possibly pushing it too far, but your point is taken nonetheless. Neva, you go.
I want to thank David for taking on that question. The one thing I would say is actually we agree more than we disagree. What's really interesting is even the things we agree about don't get implemented. Né? And I think that we need to, that economists have tended to say somebody else's problem around implementation, and that's a problem. In terms of deconcentrating supply chains, I think we have to say, I'm sure you know this, the question is what actually led to the suppression of small business in South Africa. And by the way, that's why we talk so much about ownership. We've done huge amounts of stuff on income. We have some of the most, we have amongst the most unequal wage distribution in the world also. But as I'm sure you know, the World Bank says the two things that lead to reproduction of inequality is assets and education. And I think they leave a few things out there, but I think that is why we talk so much about assets. And then there's the land question, of course, which, However, one of the problems in South Africa is that apartheid actually destroyed most small business. So in other countries, people at least inherit from their families some kind of assets, some kind of existing production structure or sales structure. They have a customer base, they know where they have to buy things, they have some knowledge of production and bookkeeping. Here we tend to say to people, and there are market institutions to serve them, and they have a site, where they can function. Here we tend to say to people, start with nothing and find a way to make a business work. So I would argue we need to think much more holistically, whether it's in terms of land reform or in terms of township economies, about what would you have to do to provide all those things that are missing in South Africa that exist in other developing economies to support small and micro enterprise. In that context, part of it is how do you, where relevant, link people into the formal value chains? How do people articulate with the formal value chains in a way that's more advantageous? And honestly, we could, as you know, go on for days and days about it. But I think to me it's more that issue, that's only part of the problem. That if we don't also address how do you ensure that people have production skills, have bookkeeping skills, have capital, have a site, have upstream and downstream linkages, have access to skills, and what are the market institutions that would deliver all of that? And by market institutions, it might be an NGO. It might be a co-op. But that the existing market institutions tend to exclude them. And I mean, the obvious one that everybody knows about is retail chains. You can't get into a retail chain as a small business in this country. So in effect, that market institution is not serving them. No?
Yeah, I want to respond to Neva and a few tweets. Kind of saw, a few tweets, kind of especially from our students who said Professor Malone is becoming a right winger. So I want to make clear what my views are on the kind of issue of state-owned enterprises. I'm not saying necessarily that ESCOM should be privatized, but I do think ESCOM should be broken up, and it should be properly regulated. So, and I think that's a fundamental difference. So, I think we kind of shouldn't be ideological about this. I think it's not a question about whether kind of ownership in kind of in the state or kind of ownership in the private sector is the right thing. I think it's about how we make sure that the utilities are priced in a way which is going to kind of help us to get growth, and is going to be priced in a way that serves the people, not serves certain interests. And I think in the Eskom case, it's quite clear that the structure that they're in is forcing them to keep out much more efficient producers of energy. And that's something that we have to deal with. We have to break them up, and it's not a question of privatization. I mean, on the kind of question of kind of South African Airways, I think we must ask ourselves, how much do we pour into this, and what are the reasons for it to be in the public space? I can't see any good reasons for that. I want to also say something about the informal economy and the township economy, because I can't resist it. I have to say, I find the idea of the way we describe it as the township economy something that I find repulsive, because it's saying that those who kind of operate in that part of the economy are somehow not part of the mainstream of the economy. I'm kind of often struck when I'm in countries such as India. You see lots of low-income enterprise that is supported by both the middle class and the upper classes. So walk around Bombay, Delhi, and you see those with income supporting the economic activity of those who don't have high incomes. I think the problem here is we have an economy where those who produce with low incomes don't enjoy the support of those who have incomes to spend, and there's a really odd way about which around which the economy operates. For me, it's not about the sort of township economy. It's about the fact that those in sort of power really operate in a way which excludes small operators. And I think we need to move away from sort of talking about the township economy to really dealing with this problem.
Neva, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. No, I just wanted to say, I always understood township economy, and maybe somebody should clarify, this is another vague signifier or whatever, to mean these have been treated as dormitory towns. How do we make the townships more holistic? So it's not the whole of small business or informal business. It's about how do we make the townships, in terms of David's spatial thing, places where people can find work and recreation and so on, and not just be dormitories.
Okay, can I make one small story just to try and make a point? Firstly, the excuse, I guess, that you've all got your phones out is you see people being rude about us on the platform. Well, I'm very glad I can't tweet or be a twit. I've seen what it costs certain politicians who shall not be named. But I live in a place called Emmarentia, and we get a newsletter, and we got one last night, and it said, crime wave, as usual. And there was a story that said there'd been 3 armed robberies, and it was all terrible. But it then went on to say there were also an increasing number of what they called vagrants living in sleeping in shop doorways and so on. And then it began to say, please can you understand that these are construction workers working in your suburb, and they are being paid 600 Rand every 14 days. So they can't afford to go home. And they sleep here, and every 14 days with that 600 bucks they go home, because that's their wage for 2 weeks. And please can you therefore interrogate your builders so they actually pay a decent wage to their workers. And then you look who it was written by, and it was written by the local DA councillor. And everything is completely topsy-turvy in this world. So what a political message you may expect from one place comes from a complete other, but the bottom line that remains the same is that poor black workers are being screwed. In the suburbs, in this case. It could be anywhere else, in any other case. And that, I think, is the bottom line that the panel is trying to deal with. So you had your chance. I'm going to come back. Let me take 3 from this side, then I'll come back that side. Is that okay? So I've got 1, 2, 3, straight down the spine of that. I think one of them accused the dean of being a right winger. Put your hands up again, please, so the mics can find you. Yeah. No, yours are coming. It's those three there. I'll
Hello?
come back.
Okay, cool. My name is Nkululeko Tselane. I'm a law student at this university, which ironically I agree with all the panelists except for the head of my faculty. But my question is more on the globalization and the Africanization of our economy, because I wanna get a better understanding, because all the panelists, you kind of mentioned examples of DRC and of the Latin American countries, but you never really spoke about our relationship to them and how that relates to radical economic transformation. Because I think we understand that we can't operate in a vacuum and in that kind of thing. So maybe if you could expand on that more. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Fasiya Hassan. I'm the former Secretary General of the Wits SRC. But let me address Prof. Volodia, also the Dean of my faculty. Look, thank you, Dean, for clarifying very clearly that you were not advocating for privatization. I think that assists. But I also want to speak about, you said that we cannot be arguing something that's ideological. But it's ideology that's the backbone of our economic policy. So one cannot say that when we look at state-owned enterprises, we cannot be looking at it with some amount of ideology. I think it's 100% necessary to do so, and in doing so, we can hopefully unpack in the manner in which we deal with these things, right? But I also want to speak, and this is actually the core point that I wanted to make, particularly on Twitter. That is that privatization does not equal efficiency or service delivery. The fact that an institution is privatized, I don't know why in the minds of South Africa we assume, oh wow, this is the solution to the problem. And it's not. Privatization for me is very problematic. And I think that's maybe where we need to unpack and understand. So we can agree maybe that ESCOM needs to be broken up and divided, but that doesn't mean that we must be privatizing the ability to deliver services to our people. I think that we need to address where the actual issue is in government's inability to do that, and then what do we do to equip government to do it? And then very lastly, this was a question that I had. You spoke about short-term employment versus long-term employment. I think there's a problematic nature in that, and I can understand where it's coming from. But frankly, we don't have the option of not focusing on the long term when we have these issues in front of us. And I think maybe it's part of the problem of policymakers, right? How do they create the platform to get to the NDP while at the same time addressing the short-term inequalities that we face? Thanks, Prof. I look forward to the Twitter war after this.
There was a third hand. Yeah, there. I'm coming back. I'm going to take 3 and then I'll come up to the end there.
Cool. Hi, my name is Atina Ngamso. I'm a student. And I want to talk a little bit about the vague terms that the radical economic transformation has been set under, and ask whether, and I think the conclusion that I come to, I think applies to like small business or like each one teach one piecemeal approaches to the economy out of people's misunderstanding or desperation in the face of real South Africa. But the question I want to ask is, do you think that the term is vague because it's difficult to attach real meaning and substance to the term, or that it best works that way because we know something that we've always known, we knew it during colonialism, during apartheid, we knew it in '94, we know it now. And that is we've long reached an impasse, which is that white South Africa is not going to give up its things in order to make this country a country that works. And South Africa's economy is only going to exist insofar as it services and serves white South Africa. And when the people lay a demand for that to end, then capital will threaten to leave, and then we'll be left with what seems, at least according to Professor Imran, the foregone conclusion of the DRC. I mean, if it is the case that everybody else has kept with the social compact, has waited, has done short-term work, and we know who we're talking about when we say like short-term and long-term work, because that employment question is a question.
Be different.
That since the corruption scandals hit the press, and when Save South Africa came up with a whole lot of stats, there was indeed a pullback of the term radical, and a kind of more cautious kind of approach to say, okay, let's not maybe step on so many toes. But as David mentioned, I think right at the beginning, one of the risks is that because the idea of white minority capital and radical economic transformation as terms or as ideas was so mired in the whole Gupta issues, you know, Oak Bay and marketing companies, that the danger is that those terms that could have contained some really useful practical solutions to move us forward has now been, I suppose, treated as a hot potato, and like, oh no, we can't touch that. It's something that we have to distance ourselves from. So I think you make a very valid point.
So firstly, in terms of Africa, I think that one of the problems for South Africa is that we have, there's a, like the ratio of our GDP per capita to those of our neighbors is around 8 to 10 to 1. For the other BRICS, it's like 3 or 4 to 1. And what that points to me is this, is the countries that have managed to accelerate growth and industrialize have all had a much stronger region. So I would argue that we can't have any kind of economic development, radical or otherwise, unless we do much more to build the region. And I have to say we have been remarkably bad about it. And that's another one where I think we actually all know what some of the key answers are. We just never managed to prioritize it enough to do it. Yeah? Having said that, I mean, so I would argue, yes, you can't talk about economic development in South Africa without saying, how do we bring the region along better? How do we reduce this huge it's one of the most unequal regions in the world by every dimension. So that issue applies there. In terms of ideology and policy, I just want to say, look, I think the problem is this. Ideology does two things. It points you towards whose problems you want to address. Well, three things. It points you towards how you analyze the causes of those problems, and it points you towards solutions. Whose problems you address is not really susceptible to much research. You can research whether the problem exists and who's affected by it. But if I think the problems of the poor are more important than the problems of the rich, the research is not going to convince me otherwise. Yeah? But once you start talking solutions, the ideology can point you in a general direction, but trust me, you'd better check if those solutions make sense in your specific context. And I think that's what people say when they're saying we don't want to be entirely ideological. So they're not saying ideology doesn't influence how they think. They're saying we need to control it when it comes to coming up with specific solutions. And one of the horrifying things about doing policy is you're playing with people's lives. And you really have to try and get it. And at the same time, you really have to try and do things. So that's a tension right there. In terms of whether, I think radical economic, I was actually there when the term first came into the South African government. I have to say, it was not a consultant, it was a minister. And I think said minister, well, I'm not going to say what it was, and no, it's nobody in the room as far as I know, was just trying, where we came about it from him was, I think he was just trying to capture a commitment to real change, that there's a recognition also in government that you can't keep saying to people, be patient. And they wanted to promise change. The trouble is, and apologies to all ministers in the room, but my experience of ministers is they often make the promise and then they come to the public servants and say, now find out a way to do it. And then we find out that we actually have these very big debates about how best to do it. And I would argue those debates, like I said, reflect both the fact that government itself still operates in silos and the fact, more fundamentally, that it's a very divided society, and those divisions are reflected in the policies that are acceptable within government. And that's implementation, that we don't have any central group that can actually say, now we're going to drive this one, whether it's on the right or the left. And that's also why you get this thing of like, one day we tell big business we love them, and the next day we hate them. And then we get a scare and we go back and say we love them again. So I would argue that it's vague, something radical. Radical in the sense of real change. But we don't agree about how to end up in an impasse. And then finally, some of you may remember we've had this debate before. I was with Rudy, he was saying, remember the 90s? Does it feel like we're back in the 90s? Because there's a debate about, can you get to growth without addressing inequality in a country that is as unequal as South Africa? And I think the consensus is no, you can't. But there's still a debate about how you prioritize those things. And I would argue if we're serious about getting to 4 or 5% growth, we could do it, but only if we do the structural changes towards equality that enable us to have a much more systematic policy environment and make those systematic changes that we need to bring about growth.
Okay, thank you. Now I've got hands. I know where I'm going. I'm going to take 6 last questions, 3 and 3, because it's 8:25, and the people who are going to serve food also need to go home tonight. So I understand that lots of people want to ask questions. Including people giving me dirty looks. This young man's been very patient. You're number 1. You're number 2. There's a chap here in the jumper. Number 3. That's this side done. Number 4. You two are lost out. I'm going to the very back. Number 5. And the man with the hair in the middle. Number 6. Bald people are allowed to say man with the hair in the middle. And I apologize to everyone else. We'll all be nibbling food outside. Pleasure.
He wasn't seen. Yeah, I don't know.
Radical facilitator's choice. Okay. If I didn't see anyone else, I apologize. You're welcome to leave or stay. Okay, can we get through the 6 questions and then 6 brief answers?
Okay, my name is Mfesane. I'm law lecturer here at the School of here at Wits. My concern is directed at you, Neve, and to some degree to you, Pandi, as well. On the point of there is no real face to the economy, in a sense that the JSE is owned by institutions and so on. But you'd appreciate, I'm sure as an economist better than I would, that the institutions themselves that own the shares at the JSE serve a purpose. The profits and the dividends don't go swimming in the sea. They go to pockets. And the question is, what color are the pockets? Now, the point I'm trying to get at here is this, that ultimately, if we insist on being blind on the race of the economy, that contributes to the agitation. That's why we have these frustrations around radical economic transformation and so on and so forth. When we talk about inclusive growth, what are we talking about? It's a racial issue. Isn't it then that the very reason we're at the point we're at and we have this agitation and social unrest and so on and so forth, and perhaps compounding the issue of race, that we deny the existence of a color that is attached to the economy itself? It's perhaps an unfair question because an economist is not a sociologist, but you raise the point, therefore, I perhaps should be asking you the question. Is that not the agitation? And it builds from what the former president has said. White monopoly capital, what is that? I mean, what does it mean, what is that? People that own shares in these companies are white by color. They're not black. Isn't that therefore the issue that we have to get to a point where we take away the race from the color of the shares? And until we do that, then we have a problem. So perhaps to ask you a direct question, do you see the economy as being colorblind?
Okay. Can I ask that questions are brief?
Yeah. Thanks.
He's a lawyer, he can't help it.
My name is Benedict. I'm gonna be very, very precise. I'm interested into the systematic questions, right? Because I'm getting the sense that the issue of efficiency, it keeps on shifting from private to public. I just wanted to check, Prof, from your research, has there been a research that looked at the projections if private sector can invest more locally, especially now that we're going through these economic challenges in terms of the money that they've accumulated, especially within the space of gear? Because at least I believe by that time there was enough growth. I think it went to 3.4 because I believe they targeted 6%. And if that's the case, have private sector considered to really invest locally so that we can stimulate the economic growth? The other question, it's with regards to the policy, because I feel that there is more critique that comes to the policy, and I want to agree with Mr. Pando there, because I believe that the state post-94, they have stitched the system and the policy that I have that's research-based also is to what extent has academic and also Lubick Group had looked at the midterm strategic framework on how it links different policies so that they can speak in one term? Because I remember at the SONA this year, there was an issue on a national development plan to say that there are policies that are not really interlinked. Thanks.
Gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Sunny and I'm an activist. I just want to return to perhaps one slide that Dr. Karen Abrams spoke about. And it's important because it drives home this issue. We can't have this conversation in the current context about radical economic transformation without talking about state capture, looting, extraction, and the Guptas in a way. So I want to go back to one slide, and I have 50 of them, but I'm only going to concentrate on one. The Public Finance Management Act, and so this is empirical data, speaks about irregular expenditure for the last 5 years. So we float the number of 205,850 million. Now, the numbers are so huge that we don't think about it carefully. But I just want to give you four numbers. In terms of houses that could have been built just from the irregular expenditure, 1,880,455 houses. Tertiary degrees are and I'm assuming 175,000 rand a degree for a 3-year degree. 1,188,793 tertiary degrees. We're just using some figures, we can get it correct. And then the smart schools, it costs 120 million rand to build a smart school in Gauteng. We could have built 1,720 schools. And we could have done 5 million water and sanitary connections. We can't have this conversation about radical economic transformation when we don't talk about looting. And about state looting. We just want to talk about one more thing. 2 billion rand for given loan, for given amount of the Optimum gold mine. If you want to talk about those figures are mind-boggling. And those are just 2 incidences. We can talk about 50 incidences. In the last 2 years.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go straight to this side. One, there's one right at the back, and one in the middle, man with the hair.
Good evening. My name is Tami Bowe. I'm from a company called Simung, and we facilitate debating and public speaking tournaments for young kids in school-going age, and just to transfer the knowledge, in that space as well. Is concerned, and I think this goes to Dr. Neva, and how historically and currently our posture is to look at getting black people ownership spaces in very established companies, and by expanding the BEE quota system and all those kinds of things. But what it has worked out to be historically is that it created an entirely new black elite as opposed to distributing the reparations of apartheid down to people on the ground and people actually benefiting. And surely, like from a developmental state perspective, the more important thing to be doing or concentrating on is trying to open up the economy so that black people can own competitive businesses in the economic space, as opposed to trying to open up spaces of ownership where they've never owned these businesses in the first place. So I think the conversation of Professor Somadota Fikeni and many other scholars as well, is that over the past 23 years, we've gone through so many policies, and what seems to be common thread as a problem has been the implementation discipline. So my question is, with the rhetoric around radical economic transformation, with this new wave of rhetoric coming up, does it mean, one, that the current policy, the NDP, is completely in tandem with this rhetoric? Or does it mean that we are looking at a whole new policy framework, policy picture altogether? And isn't that what makes, like, drives investment crazy in this country anyway? The fact that we are very sporadic and ill implement and stick to policy implementation altogether. Thank you.
Which otherwise is supposed to deal with fiscal policy and not the microeconomics of trade policy in terms of what is needed in industrialization. So it looks like there is an attempt to deal with the inequalities outside of its causal factor, which is capitalism. So the problem is capitalism, and you can't therefore say that the issue of ownership doesn't matter. It does matter. The issue is, how do you deal with the ownership question? Is, do you de-racialize capitalism? You just transfer shares from white shareholders to black shareholders. What is the impact on ordinary people on the ground? That is what should be dealing with that. Then the transfer of wealth should be to say that, let us transfer the ownership of South Africa's capital from few individuals to majority, through a variety of interventions that could be put there. There are attempts to could deal with it in a different way. Even in the most capitalist of countries, there's a story which you must do history, a background check on, called Jean Lewis in the UK, which is owned by its own workers. But there can be a proper balance of benefiting workers, such that at the end of every financial year, workers receive dividends as well. Not just the pension funds are receiving dividends, like as is the case now, because a substantial component of South Africa's economy is owned by pension funds and these asset management companies, but those do not benefit people directly in the immediate.
Can we
So
get
it's a different question that must be looked into. Lastly, I don't know why you're discussing radical economic transformation, because one, there's no scientific meaning of it. too that it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. Like Malusi came to the Standing Committee on Finance, and then in his main presentation, he says, we're in pursuit of radical economic transformation. And when we ask him, what do you mean by that? He says, no, we're still going to resolve in the policy conference. And the policy conference is passed now. There's still no resolution of what is radical economic transformation. It means nothing. It depends on who woke up where, what day, and how they feel that day. So different politicians in the ANC, they just call it whatever they want to call it. There is no such thing as radical economic transformation. It's a farce that is just being utilized for factional politics of the ANC. And to different politicians, it means different things. So I don't know whether there can be a successful academic pursuit of something called radical economic transformation, because it doesn't exist. It's just a rhetoric that is meaningless, and it's not even mainstreamed into government policy in terms of what has to be pursued from now on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, panelists, you have 1 minute each.
I have nothing.
Pandi, nothing. Karen, nothing. Imran.
So let me try to deal with the questions by going back to the metaphor that I started with. I still believe that we can get our economy growing in a way where we could transform South Africa into being something like Sweden. And the kind of lessons that I take from Sweden are, one, that you have a private sector which is disciplined enough to make its investments in the national interest. I can see a public sector that was dramatically efficient, and where public investment was extremely efficient, where kind of ownership was dramatically distributed in a way which changed the ownership sort of patterns in Sweden. But for me, the most important lesson from Sweden is that they had the ability to make really really intelligent choices around around how they drove their economic growth. So what's not well known is that for much of its growth period, what Sweden did is not what's traditionally believed, that they increased wages. In fact, Sweden compressed its wages for large amounts of its growth phase, because it was in the interests of the Swedes to do that. And now, before Fasia tweets that the dean's promoting wage compression in South Africa, I want to be clear that I sort of don't support that. But what I do support is us making intelligent choices around questions of economics, and I think that's something that we have to start with.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that the question about ownership, I think, has actually been answered by people here. The only thing I wanted to say is that, firstly, we're at a time of memorial events. You know, what they said in the 1969 strategy and tactics was specifically to say, we don't want to just change ownership at the top, change the race of the owners. We want to change the structure of the economy to benefit the majority. So I think, of course, capitalism in South Africa and capital is racial in many ways. But if we de-racialize without changing those structures, as people have said, we're not going to get very far. I mean, class aligns with race, but we can address the race issues without fixing the class issues. I don't think you could do the opposite. And there are costs to narrow BEE. I mean, the way it's now structured in mining, we're actually encouraging speculation. Because we're saying you can buy it at the top of the market, and when you start making a So I think that it's not so simple just to say we can do both. There are costs to all of these things and trade-offs, and we need to really think about them. And in that context, I think the issue of the accountability of the state is a problem. I don't think it's simple. I think it's a little simple just to say it's because it's semi-privatized. I think we should be saying, what are the decision-making systems that let officials and politicians make decisions that are not in the interest of the majority? Part of that is, as people have pointed out, that the election system assumes that people would be insecure enough they would have to be accountable. And of course that hasn't happened, and it's a little hard to fix if you're not too fond of the opposition parties, but there you go. But also with, elections only happen every few years, and you don't want to just elect a dictator every few years. So we should also be saying, why is it that people in national and provincial departments and even municipalities can be so unaccountable? That it's only when they start being threatened by elections we start hearing about the need for radical economic change. I mean, this is now, we could have a whole other debate on this. Because I think it's quite hard to manage the issue that you want national departments that are powerful enough to restructure the economy, but you want them to be close enough to the people that they actually answer to people's needs. And then one last thing, honestly, I hear what people are saying about radical economic change is an empty slogan, but what it was really about was saying we need to fix the economy. And that I think is actually was an important step forward. But to say we can't just ask people to continue to be patient, we'll fix the schools, we'll fix the healthcare, we know what we're doing there, but the economy continues to be one of the most unequal in the world. That I think that's what it's trying to address, and that's actually something worthwhile.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I think we should all say thank you to Minister Gigaba, because without him, I think we had a really good debate. I think I'm going to get a clap for that one later. Please thank the panelists, all of whom did, I think, a great job. To our guests, Trevor Manuel, Walid, Max Sisulu, the Tambo grandchildren, all of you are invited. There are snacks outside. Please go and eat and be merry. The panelists will mingle, and you can have your questions that I didn't allow you to ask in the hall. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Welcome.